Well, um, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Rachel Edgell. I am representing ESM Prep, which is a company. We are originally American, but we're based in London. So that's where I'm working out of our London office. And I'm here with Jenny, and we are going to talk about applying to both US and UK universities from Asia. So whether you're interested in both or just one or the other, we hope that we can give you all the information you need to sort of figure out which process is best for you or for your student, or how to manage both at the same time. So I will show you an overview of what we will talk about today. So we'll introduce ourselves a little bit, our backgrounds, and our respective focuses, and then we will go through, I think, fairly systematically the UK process, the US process, what are the differences between the two, because I think despite sharing a lot of similar vocabulary, they actually are quite different, and so hopefully we'll be able to show you just how different they are. And we will also talk about the timelines for each, which again are very different, and so hopefully that will help you get a sense of when you need to get started and what you need to do at the various points, and then we will take some questions from viewers during the presentation. Please feel free, if you have a question, you can enter it in the Q&A feature here on Zoom. We'll try to monitor the questions, but depending on how many we get, we may not be able to answer them during the presentation. So we will definitely reserve some time at the end to answer as many questions as we can, but do feel free to send those whenever they occur to you. So I will just give a little bit more background on myself and ESM Prep, and then I will pass over to Jenny, who can introduce Keystone Tutors and what they do. So as I said, my name is Rachel Edgell. I am originally from the US, but I live in London now. I graduated from Princeton University, and then afterwards I did my teacher training, and I got involved in different sort of education, I don't know, industries, I suppose, and eventually decided that this is what I really liked doing, which is helping students, and especially international students, apply to US universities, because it is quite a long and complicated process, and I think it really helps having someone who has gone through it and who has sort of had the different perspectives as well, coming from a school background, and now sort of working with universities and so on to keep everyone updated on the changes that have been happening the last few years especially. And so because I'm based in London, I often work with students that are based in Asia. The time difference works out really well, and as I said, I am very used to working with international students and sort of translating the US application process, because if you're familiar with the with the UK process, it's quite different to that. And if you're not necessarily familiar with either one, then I think it's probably quite different to whatever application process you might be familiar with. So that is who I am, and I'll pass over the microphone.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm Jenny McGowan. So I work for Keystone Tutors, which is a kind of UK education company. So we focus on UK schools and universities and kind of all of the UK-based systems. I am normally based in Hong Kong. I'm actually currently in London because I'm got stuck after Christmas with all the travel restrictions, but I'm normally based in Hong Kong, and Keystone has offices in Hong Kong and Singapore, and my job is to kind of oversee those offices and support students applying from those countries, but we also work with kind of students in Japan and China and all over Asia as well. So yeah, so my expertise is kind of advising families applying to both schools and universities. And as Rachel, I also did teacher training and worked in a secondary school in the UK. So I've also seen it from the teaching side of kind of helping students apply to university as a teacher. And then now I kind of do it on the other side, where we're working alongside what teachers are doing, but just kind of providing that added support for families that would like that extra support. So yeah, that's who I am.
Yes, and ESM Prep and Keystone have worked together in the past. I think we complement each other really well, because as Jenny was saying, there are, I think, a lot of instances where it's helpful to have someone outside of the school just providing that extra one-on-one time, a little bit of a different perspective, and so on. And I think together we work very well with students that want to apply to both UK and US, because as you will see very shortly, there are some substantial differences between the two. So I think we'll start by just talking about how students should decide whether or not to apply to the UK or to the US, by talking about whether or not they are a good fit for the different educational systems, and what that looks like and how to sort of determine that. So we can start with the UK, and then we'll talk about the US.
Great, thanks. So I guess the big difference, and obviously Rachel, you'll be able to kind of compare the other side that's often between the UK and the US, is the kind of being academically focused in the UK on one subject versus the US, where it's not quite so specific. So I think students that are a good fit for the UK often maybe know already kind of what their academic interests are. So even within studying at school, they may have subjects that they are clearly very good at and have a passion for and want to study that in greater depth, because all UK degrees, well, the majority of degrees are kind of 3 or 4 years of studying one subject in a lot of depth. So if you pick history, you are studying history for that entire time. There's very little else that you will study. So I think generally for the UK, it does attract students that have a very clear idea of maybe what they want to do, and they have clear interests in terms of what they want to study, I think is the first point I would make. And then just on these other bullet points, I've added to do with being kind of independent as well. I think that the UK university system, there's less guidance and support generally from the university staff that you work with. And by that, I don't mean that they just leave you on your own and you don't have any support at all, but more that you are expected to do a lot more of independent work. I did my master's, for example, at Oxford, and there were some US students on the course, and I remember them being quite surprised by how little input at times the professors and so on would give you on essays. They felt like you were just left to your own devices to do it a little bit. And obviously there's pros and cons to that. So I think if you're a student that actually independently can get on with tasks, and actually you learn well and you do well in that environment independently, I do think the UK is a good fit for you. But I do think the amount of contact time and direct support is less in the UK generally. There are exceptions, obviously, for courses like medicine and things where they are fairly intense, but you are expected to be a little bit more independent in the UK. And then the final point, which I think applies to the US as well, is just about the international community. I think specifically from an Asia perspective in the UK, there are huge numbers of international students coming to UK universities, and Asia is by far the biggest feeder of those students. So I think you can arrive at a UK university and either find people that are from the same country as you, which I think helps with settling in, and you have that40%, but equally you have a diverse international community if you want to meet people from all over the world. And some of the top UK universities, maybe 30-40% of those students are from all around the world. So I think they can be quite diverse places to learn, which I don't think is dissimilar, but I thought it was just a point worth making. So that's my summary of UK universities and the fit, really.
Great. And I would say that I think you're exactly right. There is a bit of overlap, and in some ways, in part because of the fact that the US, as I think most people know, is a huge country, and there are over 4,000 universities in the US, which means that there is a huge variety of, I think I've maybe gone a bit too far, a huge variety of types of university. So there is room for students who want to be subject specialists or who are a little bit more independent, and so on. You can go to the US and do that, certainly, but I would say for most students and the universities that tend to be more popular for international students in particular, the sort of bullet points that I have here is what applies more to those. So I would say most of the universities that my international students have heard of or are interested in applying, they tend to have a liberal arts approach, whether or not they are an actual liberal arts college or more of a research university. They tend to have a liberal arts approach, which means that typically in the first 2 years of a 4-year degree, students are taking a variety of different subjects, and they're not necessarily focused on their subject, their major, until that 3rd year of their degree. So students who are a subject specialist, like I said, there are some universities where they can just jump right into whatever they want to study. But I would say for most students, you should expect to take different subjects. And universities are usually pretty accommodating. So, for example, I am much more of a humanities person. I don't dislike math, but it was not my strong suit in school. And for me, I was able to take sort of math-based courses that were geared towards students like me who are not super confident in their math skills and who are not sort of super interested in math. But I was still able to take those courses to meet the requirements of my university and to expose myself to different subjects, because I think many times at this age you might think you like something, and only upon trying it you realize it's not quite what you thought it was, or you try something new and you realize you actually really like that instead. So that's sort of the idea behind this liberal arts approach. So students that go to a US university do need to be a bit flexible because of that. A lot of universities will have sort of requirements of, as I said, taking these sort of different classes that touch on different subject areas that may or may not be your specialization. They may or may not be the most interesting thing in the world to you, but if you're a bit flexible, I think you'll get a lot out of that. The community aspect is quite big at American universities. So if you are at a boarding school, for example, or a UK curricula type school, or maybe an IB curricula, you might already have some idea of this sort of pastoral element that you will experience at an American university. Sort of in comparison to the UK university, there does tend to be a little bit more involvement from the faculty in terms of making sure that you are settling in okay, both academically and personally. There's lots of opportunity to interact with faculty, and lots of encouragement to do things outside of your academics and to join sort of societies or clubs or organizations or sports or whatever it is, to really get involved on campus and build a community. And I think a lot of that extends into the alumni network as well. So a lot of American universities have really strong alumni networks that go back to this community that they formed when they were at university. And then finally, I think if you are someone who wants international experience or has, is coming from an international background, then I think US universities are a good fit as well, because similar to UK universities, there tend to be a pretty big international cohort at university. So there would be students, as Jenny was saying, from your own country or your own region, as well as many other countries, many other regions. So you can have that sort of familiarity and also meet people from totally different backgrounds to you. And I think if you're hoping to, work internationally in the future, going to the US is a really good way to sort of take that first step of, having an international education and making those connections, especially through the alumni networks, to these, multinational corporations or, sort of government organizations or whatever it is that you might want to do in future. So if any of those things sort of appeal to you or sound like that's the kind of student you are, then I would say that yes, US could be a good fit for you. And so now we can go through the different components of the actual applications themselves. And once a student has settled on, right, I'm going to apply to the UK or I'm going to apply to the US, or both, what do you actually need to know? What do you actually need to do in order to do that? So we will start with UK again.
Great, thanks. So this is a very brief overview, should I say, of kind of applying to UK universities, given that this webinar is designed to compare both. I could spend the whole webinar talking about this alone. So I'm going to give a kind of a brief overview, but we obviously have a lot more information about this, so we can follow up with you afterwards if you have specific questions. So the UK application generally is simpler. I think that's the first thing that I would say compared to the US. So it's centralized. So in the UK, there is essentially a website that's run by an organization called UCAS, which is how you apply to university. So it's centralized. You essentially apply through this website. They then send all of that information to the universities, and everything is managed through that one portal. Which in some ways makes it obviously easier because you're doing everything once and then it gets sent to the universities that you're applying to. But I would just have a word of caution that doesn't make it easy and simple. I think because it's sometimes the myth is that it's very simple, and it is in terms of admin, don't get me wrong, but actually I think sometimes that means that people underestimate and under prepare for maybe the more competitive universities. But let me just give you an idea. So what you can do in the UK is you can apply to 5 universities, and that's the maximum number that you can apply to. So through UCAS, you pick your 5 and you apply to them per academic year. You could then the following year, reapply or apply to 5 different ones, but in one year you can only apply to 5, which is obviously more limited than other countries, whether it's the US or anywhere else, where actually you tend to be able to, in theory, apply for as many as you want to. So it's more limited in the UK that you can only apply to 5. And I think that is important because some people don't realise that, and actually, then they realise that they don't have as many options as they thought. So what goes into the UCAS application in terms of the admin, and what do you actually need to do? So I think the first thing to recognise with the UK is the focus on academic history and grades, because of what I explained earlier about them being subject specialists in terms of the courses. The universities are really looking for your academic ability within those subjects, and to make sure that academically you're going to cope with the rigors of kind of studying that subject for such a long period of time. So in short, that is the most important part of the application, and actually they care far less about extracurriculars in your broader profile. That's really not as important for UK universities, and each course will have very specific academic requirements. So they may even specify exactly which A-levels or IB or whatever you're studying. So it's really important when you're looking at UK universities that you take that into account, because often people underestimate those requirements and then they don't even meet them when they come to apply. What else then is important to UK universities and goes into the UCAS form? So there's something called a personal statement, which essentially is a written piece done by the students. It's quite short, again, compared to kind of the US, which Rachel will talk about. It's 1 page, roughly, of typed writing. It's 4,000 characters, including spaces, to be exact. And actually, again, it's academic in nature. It's sent to all 5 universities. So it's 1 personal statement for all 5. So again, it's streamlined and there's not a huge amount of personalization going into that. You also have to have a reference written by the applicant's school. Again, it's academic in nature, so teachers are asked to comment on the students' aptitude for the subjects that they've taken, their kind of attitude towards learning and school. Again, less about extracurriculars and other things. It is very much about how that student is coping with school. And if you're not applying to Oxbridge or medicine and courses like that, actually that's it. Your UCAS form is complete. However, some universities do have an interview and may have entrance exams as well. So Oxbridge is an example of that, given how competitive it is. There's a lot of entrance exams that take place that they use to screen applicants. And then there are also interviews that take place as well, which again are very academic in nature. I feel like I sound a bit like a broken record here, but ultimately it's all about your academic credentials rather than anything else. And so the interview and the entrance tests for UK universities are, purely academic. Again, they don't really have an interest in anything else that you're doing that's not related to the subject that you're applying to. So that's the kind of general components of a UK application. It all goes through this one portal, admin heavy essentially, but actually is fairly straightforward in terms of the applying. it's the kind of pre-applying where you're thinking about your suitability, have you met the requirements, that's the tricky bit, but the actual application itself doesn't take that much time to complete. And as I say, there's a lot more to it than that. I've just given a snapshot, and I can send further resources and things if you've got questions about these specific parts. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
I will say, if there's just one thing that you take away from this presentation for either of us, I think it is that focus on academics, because for the US as well, even though I think the US application has these different segments that maybe have a slightly heavier weight than they do in the UK application, and I'll talk about that in more detail. I think the academics for most universities, it still is the most important thing as well for many American universities. Sorry, I'm struggling with my presentation here. Oh, there we go. I guess there's a little bit more, Jenny, if you want to go through this, and then I'll switch over to mine.
Yeah, great. So yeah, these are just, I guess, the kind of international specific criteria that I just wanted to add, because there are some differences, not in terms of the application, but just in terms of thinking about whether you fit the criteria or not. So because the UK universities have such specific academic requirements in terms of, as I say, down to the level of the subjects that you're actually taking, you must look into whether your profile fits that. So if you're taking A-levels or IB, whether that is within Asia or maybe you're at a boarding school somewhere else in the world, that's generally fine, because A-level and IB are very accepted by UK universities. The requirements for those are very clearly listed on all pages. However, if you're not taking one of those, you do need to check whether you meet the requirements or not, because actually you can miss what they're asking for without even realizing. Like, to give you an example, I'm working with a student at the moment who's from Hong Kong, but currently actually at boarding school in Canada, and was looking at Cambridge, and Cambridge very clearly state on their website that a Canadian high school diploma is not acceptable for entry. You have to take APs, or there's another list of other things that you can take, and he was quite surprised that actually what he's studying at school isn't enough for what Cambridge were looking for. So you must check whether the international curriculum is enough, because that might be that you have to take either, as I say, something like APs in the US system, but equally an A-level, or you could actually need to take an extra qualification on top of what you're studying at school. So I just always make that point, because I think some people underestimate how specific those academic requirements are for UK universities, and if you don't meet them, they will just reject your application. The other couple of things I just wanted to mention were English language requirements, which I think again applies to most universities, but just thinking about if English is not your native language, there often will be an IELTS or some form of extra test to take, and obviously the more competitive the university, the higher scores that they expect. So what you don't want to do is apply to a really great university, get an offer, and then actually realize that you're going to struggle to meet the English requirements. So it is just worth checking what those are, because it will form part of the requirements. Then another couple of things I was just going to mention was about, again, super curricular activities, which are, I guess, different to extracurricular activities in that I feel like what I've said so far is kind of academic focus, ignore everything else for UK universities, which obviously isn't really true, because actually you can do a lot that is related to the course that you're studying. And I think my experience in Hong Kong is that actually this is the bit that students often fall down on. They focus too heavily on purely what they're doing at school and haven't done any work experience, haven't done any reading about the course that they're interested in beyond what they're studying at school. And actually UK universities are very interested in that. They're interested in your passion for that subject, and great ways to evidence that is to have taken online courses or entered essay competitions or undertaken work experience. There are lots of ways that you can show a reasoned interest in your course, that isn't related to school. And I think that is something that's missed in my experience with international applicants a little bit. And then my final point, which was just, again, because I often get asked this question, is about quotas. So are there quotas for international students applying to UK universities? And I've kind of put the answer there, is that officially, no, unless you're applying for medicine. So medicine in the UK does have a quota for international students of 7% of all medical places, which makes it very, very difficult to get onto if you're an international applicant. Other courses technically don't have quotas, and all the universities will say, nope, we don't work that way. And it's hard to kind of read between the lines sometimes. Sometimes they'll kind of say, well, actually, the international fees are higher. So if we're being cynical, having more international students is actually a good thing. Whereas others then, may have quotas simply because they get so many applications, they need to limit it in some way. But the official answer is no, unless you're applying for medicine, which does have a very clear structure. So yeah, those are, I guess, my considerations that are specifically for international applicants. And again, if you've got any questions about what I've said there, or how to find out about the academic qualifications that you're studying and so on, please do pop it in the Q&A, and we could maybe come back to that, because I realise I may have mentioned things there that not everybody knows about. So yeah, those are the specific considerations for students applying from Asia.
Great. So I think to switch over to the US perspective now, probably the biggest difference in terms of the application itself is that the US is not quite as, I guess I'll say, rigid in some ways as the UK. So for example, most US universities do not have entry requirements in the same way that the UK does. So while academics are still probably the most important component of, while academics are probably the most important component of the application, there's not necessarily a cutoff. And the US process tends to be much more contextual. So if you're applying from Asia, if you're applying from a school that has a Hong Kong curriculum versus a British curriculum in Hong Kong, for example, you will be evaluated in that specific context. So international students are not necessarily expected to do the same things that American students do that are applying from the US. And I think that's a big misconception. So I've had students in East Asian countries, ask about extracurricular activities, for example. The overall sort of advice that I can give is that American universities want to see students doing the best that they can, given whatever their circumstances are. And they do recognize that your circumstances might be very different to someone else's, and you would not be held to the exact same standard. So there's no need to try to fit into sort of an American box if you're not applying from an American curriculum. That said, I'll go over the sort of components of the American application and talk about, the sort of general advice for that. But again, it is very much a contextual process. And so they will look at where you're coming from and just, ask themselves, how did this student take advantage of whatever opportunities they had at their school and in their country and so on. So the US application, it has a lot of little pieces, and each university kind of decides exactly how much these pieces matter in relation to the other. So there isn't the, I think, uniformity that you might see in the UK in terms of, there isn't necessarily the one centralized application and so on. But overall, the advice is that a lot of universities do look for demonstrated interest. So what that means is when you apply, they're asking themselves, has this student ever shown us that they're interested in our university before? Have they signed up for our email list? Have they attended an information session? Have they visited campus? And again, you just do what you can. So obviously, if you're living in Hong Kong right now where there's a really strict quarantine, it's probably not very possible that you're going to fly to the US to visit campus and come back. That's fine. The person reading your application is typically assigned a geographic region. And so they would be like the Hong Kong person, for example, and they would know about the quarantine, and they would know that it's really not realistic for you to visit a US campus in person. So don't worry about that, but they would still expect you to, demonstrate interest in other ways. So there are always, virtual tours that you can take and information sessions that you can sign up and just, interact with admissions officers. A lot of times universities will either come to a school and give a presentation, or at least offer an information session. So ask your school careers or university guidance department, ask them what is available in terms of connecting with universities that you're interested in. Extracurricular activities do play a larger role in the US, and I think that comes back to that pastoral element that you see at a lot of US universities. There can be some overlap here with the sort of super curricular activities that Jenny was talking about. So you don't have to, again, kind of hold yourself to an American standard and try to do all of these things that just don't fit with your situation. You don't have to do that. But American universities do want to see that you're getting involved in your community. And that can look like a lot of things. Your community could be your family. If you have a grandparent living at home and you take care of them every day after school, and that's all you have time to do, then that absolutely counts as an extracurricular activity. And they would want to see you sharing that information. If you are an athlete, then that could be your community, that sport that you play. If you like to volunteer, then that could be sort of helping the greater community, whether it's your neighborhood or the world. That could be your community. So there's different definitions of community, but that's what extracurricular activities come down to in the US, is they just want to see that you're getting involved in your school, in your neighborhood, in your family, whatever that looks like to you. And again, there's not a formula that you have to volunteer, or you have to play a sport, or you have to play a musical instrument. You just need to follow your passions and your interests, and do the things that you're good at and the things that you enjoy, and do them in a sort of meaningful way, and make an impact where you can. And that's what they're looking for. Test prep, I think, again, could have an entire webinar on this, and we frequently do. So if you want more information on test prep, the SAT or the ACT, please do let me know. You can send me an email at the end of the presentation, and I can send you a previous webinar or some other information. But in short, there are two main standardized tests that historically were required by a lot of universities, although in the last couple of years it's really been an optional way to just demonstrate that you are academically capable. But again, this is not the most important component of the US application, which is why so many universities decided that it was optional during the pandemic, and instead they are focusing on your academics. So if your academics are strong, you may not need to worry about this, but it really is an individual decision. So it's something that if you have questions on, I would encourage you to reach out, and we can talk about your specific situation and what that advice might be. The US, like the UK, does have school materials that are submitted by the school on your behalf. They're a little bit different. So compared to the reference, for example, the recommendation letters in the US are a little bit more focused on who you are as a person rather than who you are strictly as a student. So there will be a little bit of overlap, of course, but again, the US is looking for, how is this person going to contribute to our community? So if we accept this student, what kind of neighbor are they going to be? What kind of friend are they going to be, right? Not just what kind of student are you going to be? So that's sort of what they're looking for in those recommendation letters. In terms of the application itself, there's not the limit that there is in UCAS, where you can only apply to 5. So in the US, you can theoretically apply to as many universities as you want. But I would say for most students, it's usually somewhere between 5 and 10, just because the application itself might be, used more than once. So we've got the Common App, for example, the Common Application, which is a little bit similar to UCAS, where you fill in your information one time, you have one personal statement, and that does get sent to each university that is on your list. But not every university uses the Common App. So some big examples would be MIT or Georgetown, or the University of California system. They all have their own applications that you would have to fill out in addition to the Common App. So that's something just to research and keep in mind. But theoretically, you can apply to as many universities as you want, but just know that each university, likely has a little bit of extra work, which I will talk about very shortly with the supplemental essays. The personal statement, it typically gets sent to every university. Again, there's just those few exceptions like Georgetown, MIT. But the biggest thing I will say is that it's very different to the UK personal statement. So the UK personal statement is very academically focused, and it's sort of showing that you're a suitable candidate for whatever you want to study. Whereas the US personal statement is much more of a reflective, introspective piece of writing. It can be a creative writing piece, it can be a personal narrative, but it's you sort of sharing again who you are as a person and not necessarily who you are as a student, which is what they're universities will look at your courses and your grades or your scores, and your SAT or your ACT, and that's how they will kind of determine your academic suitability. But through these other things, these recommendation letters and your personal statement, they want to know who you are as a person and how you might contribute to campus outside of classes. And then there are typically for each university supplemental essays. So some universities have 0, but I would say most have at least 1, and some can have 2, 3, 4, 5. It really depends on the university. So again, it's really important as you are sort of filling in your university list to look at what are the what are the application requirements for each university. How many essays will I have to write? Is it just one essay that's asking me, why are you applying to Northwestern? Or is it like Stanford, where it's asking me lots of little essays, what do you want to study? And can you write a letter to your future roommate? And what's something that you're looking forward to about attending Stanford, and so on. So that is where that work really starts to pile up if you have quite a large list of universities. And it's possible to apply to a lot of universities, but it's something that takes a lot of planning and it requires starting very early. So we will talk about timelines in a little bit, and I'll come back to this, but just to sort of preview again. Then finally, I think again, a big difference with UK is the interview. It tends to have a much smaller role in the US application process. A lot of universities do offer interviews, but they are typically conducted by alumni of that university. So for example, I used to do interviews for Princeton, and they were very casual conversations. They were not at all subject specific. It was about 30 minutes of me just asking student, what is your favorite subject in school? What do you do sort of extracurricular wise? Why do you want to apply to Princeton? Do you have any questions for me? And it's really typically a very small part of the application process, and not necessarily an indication of being shortlisted or anything like that. So I think those are the overall main differences. So I think you can see already that it's a very different process to the UK, which is why I think Jenny and I are both here, and we're trying to sort of give you this overview. And I think similar to what Jenny said about the UK, this is the shortest, tiniest introduction to the US process, and there's so much more information. And we do have separate webinars where we go through this in much greater detail. And I'm always happy to answer specific questions. So we'll save some time for that at the end. And I think both of our emails are on the last slide as well, so you can email us afterwards. But just as a quick overview of the US process and how it differs from the UK. Try to move on to the next slide here. I don't know if I think it takes a minute to load. Okay. Here we go. So this is, we've talked about a little bit of this already, but the main differences between the UK and US applications. So I think Jenny said that, these sort of supercurricular, extracurricular activities, they can benefit the UK, but it's not quite to the same extent, I think, as it is in the US, at least for extracurricular activities like things like, sports or music or Model United Nations or whatever it is you're involved with. Personal statement, I think, as we both said, it tends to be a little bit more subject specific for the UK and a little bit more reflective and about you as a person in the US. The difference between references and recommendations we talked about. And then finally, the differences in interviews. So Jenny, I don't know if there's anything else in particular that you want to add here, but I think we've touched on most of this.
Yeah, no, I think we've kind of gone through them already. Yeah, I think that makes total sense already based on what we've said.
Okay, perfect. So now we'll do a quick look at some timelines. So just to start with the US here, it is a much longer process. And the sort of unofficial start can be as early as what in the US we typically call freshman year, or 9th grade. And then if you're in the UK system, that would be year 10. So when we say it starts, I guess what I mean by that is when you apply to university in the US, this is how far they go back to look at your school records and your academics and your extracurricular activity and so on. They look at those. There are 4 years of high school basically, so it's 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade, or year 10 through year 13 in the UK system. So that's what constitutes high school for most US universities. And then, as it says here, UK typically starts a little bit later, but I think, Jenny would agree that there's no harm in starting unofficially early in terms of thinking about what you want to study and how you can work on those supercurriculars and so on. But we'll go through the specific timelines. So Jenny, if you want to start with the UK and kind of how that timeline is broken down, maybe more officially.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, the previous slide obviously highlighted the fact that most students start thinking about their UK university applications in the last kind of 2 years of school. So typically that would be when you start your A-levels or your IB studies, if you're within those systems. And this timeline here, just to be clear, is kind of our preparation timeline, as opposed to necessarily a kind of a fixed timeline that everybody should follow. So what we normally recommend is that kind of at the start of year 12, often in the summer after year 11. So just in case anyone is unsure, at the end of year 11, many students will have taken GCSEs or like O-levels if you're in Singapore, for example. So you've taken kind of qualifications at that point and you're waiting to start new ones in year 12. So often that's summer. A lot of students get started on thinking about what they want to study. And then that continues through year 12. So kind of what's marked on these timelines underneath are actually kind of our preparation suggestions. So starting to do some guided reading, maybe with a tutor that studied what you're interested in, so that you're exposed to what that course is like at university, because again, there's this academic focus where you really need to be sure that you're picking the right thing because you're committing to it for quite a long period of time. And so throughout year 12, that process is happening in terms of deciding on the course, and then deciding on which 5 universities you want to pick. Often that's quite grade dependent. So we definitely always recommend course first, and then you think about which 5 universities, because often you won't know how you're doing in your A-levels and your IB, for example, maybe until Easter or even like the summer of year 12. And if your teachers then say, oh, actually, we think you're going to get, I don't know, 38 in your IB, and actually you were hoping they were saying 44, you may then have to rethink those 5 universities, because as I've said before, they will have specific recommendations. So year 12 is definitely about exploring course, and then the deciding on the 5 universities definitely comes towards the end of that year, once you've got a better idea of how your academic grades are doing. In terms of the actual timeline to apply, so the deadlines are in year 13, so the final year of school. If you are applying for Oxford or Cambridge for any course, or you're applying for medicine, dentistry, or veterinary science, the deadline is October 15th, so in the middle of the kind of autumn term, whereas any other university or any other course, the deadline isn't until January. So you have a bit longer if you're not applying to those kind of very competitive courses. And you'll see on this timeline as well that there's a kind of a few other things mentioned on there in November, December time. So again, if you're applying for those competitive courses at Oxbridge, medicine, you may have aptitude tests, which are generally in November, and then interviews, which are generally in December, but those timelines do vary slightly depending on the university. So it's all wrapped up essentially by Christmas, normally of year 13, and then you're just waiting to hear from the universities after that. And I think, as Rachel said, obviously you can start preparing or thinking about this long before that, but I think in the UK traditionally, and especially if you're in a British curriculum, if you started asking your teachers about university in year 9 or 10, they probably would just tell you to go away and come back in a couple of years, because that's just the norm, is that it starts in year 12. But it is worth thinking about things you can be doing before that. So for example, work experience, especially if you are looking at courses that are vocational, so medicine, law, the more work experience and exposure you get, the better. So if you can do those things in the school holidays when you're younger, by all means, it's a great thing to be doing. But the reality is you're not actually starting to think about your actual application and where you're applying until until year 12. And a lot of the work happens in the summer between year 12 and 13, where you're putting together your personal statement, preparing for any tests, and there are students that apply to the UK quite late, should I say. They come to us a couple of weeks before the deadlines, and you can scramble it all together. You absolutely, admin wise, can get a UCAS application done in a really short period of time. You've then just got to be realistic about the courses that you're applying to, because if you're aiming for something like medicine and you've done no work experience, no wider reading, you're not going to probably get a place because your application is not going to be strong. But if you were applying, let's say, for something like history, you probably could throw together a fairly good application as long as you can write well and so on in quite a short period of time. But obviously, the longer you give yourself, the better. And I think Rachel obviously will talk more about the US, but I think my other key point, which I think we both are in agreement on, is that if you have any intention of doing both, you need to start even earlier, because trying to juggle the two is a significant amount of work. Even if the UK is deemed simpler, students struggle to manage both. We both see it on both sides of the families that we're working with. So if you are thinking of doing both, I think whatever timelines we're talking about, you need to shift them a bit earlier just to spread it out a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. We'll look at the US timeline in a moment, but I think similarly, a lot of the work is done this summer before a student's final year of school. And so I will often actually ask my students to commit specifically to either meeting every single week that summer, save a few weeks for holiday and things like that, or dedicate basically their entire August, because it's not possible to do an application well during the school year. Students try every year, and every year I think they realize that I was right from the beginning, that it's really not a good idea to try to do your application while you're in school. You can certainly start sort of at the end of your penultimate year, your 11th grade, or year 12 in the UK. I think you could start while you're in school, but you need to have that time in the summer to actually do the bulk of the work, because it is so much work. And second that if you are thinking of applying to the UK as well, because it's just it does take a lot of work, and I think students underestimate that, and then they are sorry for it later. So we're trying to warn you all in advance. This is what you should expect, and do start earlier. It's never too early in the sense that you can always ask us, what should I be doing now? So you can always ask that, and I think we can tell you, oh, you need to start right now, or you've got some time, but here's some things you can do to sort of explore in the meantime. So for a US application, this is the way to think about the visual that I have here is this is the time frame in which these different components of the application are considered, I guess we'll say. So as I mentioned earlier, universities will go all the way back to 9th grade, which is again year 10 in the UK system. So they'll go back to that year when it comes to looking at the different courses, the different subjects that you've taken, and the grades or scores that you've gotten in those, and the extracurricular activities that you've been involved in, and they will consider if you've demonstrated interest all the way back to then. That's not to say that, from that year, you must know exactly what you're doing and you must have everything perfect. That's not true. But they will look back that far. And what they want to see is just some sort of progression. So it's okay if you sort of, struggled a bit at the beginning, as long as you caught yourself and you made some, you were on an upward trajectory in terms of academics. It's okay if you actually it's encouraged to try different extracurricular activities at the beginning, and then sort of settle on, this is what I like, this is what I'm good at. And it's perfectly fine if you haven't been demonstrating interest in those early years, because you don't know which universities are interesting to you yet. That's completely fine. But just to say, if you had visited or done anything that could be of note for a university. So standardized tests, I would say the typical student is taking them in their penultimate year of school. Some students do take them earlier if they are prepared. You may as well get them out of the way and just move on to other things. But there's a fairly wide window in which students can take the test, but I will say that they often do require months of preparation. You can work on your own, but I would say most students benefit from working with a tutor. So we do have tutors that specialize in the SAT, ACT, and can help students, not necessarily understand the content, because I find a lot of students, coming from East Asia in particular, know the content. They are comfortable with, the level of math that's on the tests. They're comfortable with the English grammar. They have good reading comprehension and so on. But the tests are American tests, and so they have an American format. They have an American approach, and sometimes that can throw students off a little bit. They don't quite understand what a question is asking, or they're not quite sure what they're expected to do. And when someone explains that to them, they're fully capable. But so I do encourage you to look into that early and figure out what level of help you might need to prepare for those tests. And then finally, in terms of the essays, so the personal statement or the supplemental essays, as I said, you can start those at the end of your penultimate year of school, but then spend most of that summer really working on those essays. You'll do multiple drafts typically for all of your essays. It might be just 1 or 2 drafts, or it could be far more than that. It depends on your writing ability. It depends on what you're trying to express through your writing and so on. So again, I really encourage students to start early and to look at, sort of the overview of what do I need to write and when is it due and so on. And then you can ask for your recommendation letters probably at the beginning of your final year of school. As a former teacher, the more advanced notice you can give to your teachers, the better. Just so they can write on their own time and not feel pressured, which maybe wouldn't result in the best letter for you anyway. So do try to give them as much notice as possible. Typically, you would ask 1 or 2 academic teachers for a recommendation, and then your school counselor would also write a letter. So try to give them as much notice as you can. And it helps to suggest what they might write in the letter. So if there was a particular memory that you have from class that you think really shows who you are as a student and as a person, or a project that you want them to talk about, or some family background that you think is important, you can share that with them and request that they include it in their letter, which they may or may not do. But and then in terms of the actual application deadlines, there are 2 main sort of windows. So there are sort of early applications that are typically due anywhere from October to end of November. So that could be some universities will have just that one deadline that is relatively early. So for example, the University of California, they only have the one deadline at the end of November. Other universities will have 2 deadlines. They will have an early deadline in November, for example, and then they will also have a regular deadline in January. And again, this is a very big topic that I could talk a lot about, but I would say for most students, applying early is better. It can just be a relief to be finished. It can sometimes show a university just how committed you are if it's an early decision application where you are signing an agreement basically that if you're accepted, you will attend this university. That can give universities quite a lot of confidence that, if they accept you, you will, of course, attend. Or it can just show that you're very organized and so on if you're just applying early and there's no sort of commitment involved. So I would say typically I suggest that, but it can be an individual discussion and something that I would really advise you to think about and talk to someone, whether it's me or your school counselor. And there's also the regular window, which tends to be the first week of January, I would say, for most universities, but there's always outliers. So that's roughly when all of this work comes to a head. So that would be the application timeline. But I would say, again, for most of my students, I try to have everything finished before they even go back to school, or at least 90% finished, just so that you don't have to worry about finishing essays and studying for the SAT and whatever it is on top of all of the stuff that you're doing at school. So that would be the overall timeline. And again, if you have questions about this, please post them in the Q&A, or questions about anything at all now. So I think we can take 5-10 minutes here and try to answer as many questions as we can. I know we've got a couple of questions in the chat already, but both of our emails are here. So if you do have specific questions or you want to arrange a quick chat with either one of us, please do feel free to send us an email, and we'll take a look at questions, yes, we can absolutely send the presentation afterwards. Good. And we've recorded this as well, so if you want to rewatch it, or if you want to share it with anyone, we've tried to make that pretty easy for you. So yeah, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. You can ask them anonymously if you prefer. But Jenny, any last thoughts that you want to share before or as we wait for questions?
No, I don't think so. I think I was just going to say, which I think we've mentioned already, is that there are kind of, obviously we're both running separate webinars that go into these kind of topics in a lot more detail. So I think if you're kind of on the Keystone mailing list, you would have already kind of received those, because we've sent them out to you already in February. We've got a couple of webinars, one generally about UCAS and applying, and one is about Oxbridge specifically. But if you not signed up to kind of our newsletters, or you're a current kind of ESM family, do let me know, and I can send you kind of links to those. They are all on our website as well, but just to kind of bring attention to the fact that those are coming up, and we'll probably answer lots of questions that you might have already. We could send those out actually, because if we're going to send the slides, we can include the links maybe to those as well and send it all together. Yeah,
definitely. And I see we have a question about pricing. I think that's probably a better question to if you want to email us. I think it can be probably a little bit nuanced in terms of I don't know how it works for Keystone actually, but for ESM, for example, it depends on the age of the student. It depends on the sort of the number of universities that a student might be applying to, and so on. So it's we have sort of ranges that we can certainly give you, or we're happy to have an actual conversation, and then we can give you a specific quote based on your circumstances. But in terms of pricing, at least for ESM, please do reach out to me individually, and I can send you all the information that you might need.
Yeah, and we're very similar in the sense that we always have a kind of initial free chat with a family to find out what their situation is and what they're looking for, and then we can propose. We have kind of bigger services that guide students through the whole process, or we equally can do one-off chats if you've just got a couple of questions. But yeah, we're always happy to have a free chat in the first instance, so do drop me an email if you'd like to arrange that. Great, I think that's probably looks like we're all good.
Okay, good. So I hope that means we've answered all of your questions preemptively, but if not, if anything comes up later, you realize you forgot to ask or so on, again, our emails are right here. Always happy to answer questions via email, or as Jenny said, arrange a quick free chat just to sort of discuss the situation and provide a little bit of initial guidance, whether or not I think you decide to work with us in the end. So thank you all very much for tuning in. We hope this was helpful and provided some guidance on where to go from here, because it is a long process. But I think this was the first step for many of you. So very happy to see you here, and always open if you do have questions.
Great. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and hopefully useful, and do get in touch if there's anything else. And thank you, Rachel, as well, for organising.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. It's always helpful for me to learn more about the UK process as well, and I'm sure there's always more for you to learn about the US, because yes, it is quite complicated. So all right, I hope everyone has a great day, and we will send out the reporting and so on afterwards. But in the meantime, do reach out if you have any questions. So take care. Thanks.